We're not a net producer of knowledge for the world as we were in history, but we're not today.
Hi, I'm Shoma Chaudhury. Thanks for watching Enquiry. As India stumbles in the global eye for mishandling its pandemic and its vaccine commitments, our guest on the show today telescopes us out more broadly to assess India on the world stage. How is India positioning itself? How does India relate to China, America, and the changed global dynamics? What is one missing in the rising China story? And what has Prime Minister Modi got right and wrong in his foreign policy? To discuss all of that, I have Shiv Shankar Menon, former National Security Advisor to India, a strategic scholar and a China expert. He's also recently written a book on India and Asian geopolitics, which assesses its past, present, and future. This show was recorded a few days ago. Thank you so much for joining me on Enquiry, Shankar. It's a real pleasure to have you.
Thank you for asking me. Thank you. It's good of you.
So, Shankar, I want to, you've written your book on Asia and geopolitics and, with a particular view from India's vantage point. But before I pull you into that, I want to focus on the immediacy of our time. And so I want to start with the whole vaccine diplomacy that India did and the fact that we've now had to take aid, which everyone is saying is a big departure from the previous decade or so. How do you read this? Was India on the right path in offering vaccines to other countries? And do you see this aid as necessary right now or really a big shame for India?
It seems to me that we should take help from wherever we can get it. We should do whatever we can for our people. Given the situation and how serious it is, I think there's no question that, so is it advisable to take the aid and so on? I think that's an academic question now. I think given the situation, we need to. Should we be in this position? That's a different issue. Whether it was right to export at that time the vaccine, there's a whole host of complicated factors here. Vaccines can't be kept forever. So it's not as though you can stockpile them forever and wait. At that time, the calculus was that we would not need them. So I don't know on what basis they came to that conclusion. Clearly, it was wrong. It's been proved wrong by the facts later. But I don't think the middle of a crisis is a good time to actually do a postmortem of what went wrong and how decisions were taken.
That brings us actually to this whole idea of India that India has of itself. And that's in fact the premise of your book as well, which is that India has always had a sense of exceptionalism, and typically one thinks of American exceptionalism, but you say India has that sense of itself. What are the attributes of that exceptionalism? And do you think that this government's projection of the Modi government's projection of India, is something that you support? Do you think they've been doing a good job at? So two parts to that question.
I think the Indian exceptionalism, the sense of exceptionalism, has a basis, in fact, in our geography. As I say, we are the only subcontinent in the world, the Indian subcontinent. And as a subcontinent, we are both part of a bigger continent, but we're also unique, we're also separate. And so our geography gives us this sort of pull between being part of a larger area, but also being special, being unique. Our history, I think, our location as a peninsula in the heart of the Indian Ocean, connected to everyone by the seas and through history. And in fact, we've done best when we are most connected to the rest of the world. But so, and today when you look at our situation, you can't find another country like us at our stage of development with our kind of expansive interests, connected to the world, but also unique in many cultural other ways. So you can't find another country which shares all your interests exactly the same. And this is why we've been online, we've followed strategic autonomy. So there is a basis for an Indian sense of exceptionalism. But the point that I try and make in the book is that don't take it to cutting yourself off from the rest of the world. Because if you do, frankly, the lesson of history is that you do better when you're connected, when you're engaged with the world. And today we need the world, whether it is for energy, We depend on the rest of the world, whether it is for investment, whether it's for technology, whether it's for export markets, so that 80% of our imports are today maintenance imports. And to take care of our own interests. Today, we have an interest in, let's say, the freedom of navigation right through the Indo-Pacific. We can't do this alone. You look at the big challenges, climate change. We can't do that alone. So we need to work with other people. We need to engage with the world, find partners and work with them. And this is true across the board. If we want to transform India, we need to work with other people. If we want a peaceful environment around us, we need to work with other people. So I'm a bit nervous by what I've seen in the last few years. To answer your second question, I've seen actually an indrawing and a sort of closing off of the world. We walked out of the RCP negotiations after 8 years of negotiation. We've been raising tariffs, so we're cutting our economy off, we're getting more protectionist. We say Atmanirbharta, but it shades into autarky, and we've tried that in the 60s, early 70s, and it didn't work. We know, we can compare what happened when we tried that and when we opened up the economy. You can see the difference in the results. Some of these ideas that we've heard, like Vishwaguru and so on, frankly bear no relationship to reality. We're not a net producer of knowledge for the world as we were in history, but we're not today. Today we depend on the rest of the world for knowledge generation, for technology and so on. And we have a long way to go still.
If you were in a seat of power right now, how would you be positioning India in the global order? So when you say that this government is raising, tariffs and it's trying to cut itself economically, and yet it's, Mr. Modi, especially in the first couple of years since he became prime minister, went out on a blitzkrieg of international diplomacy. What would you, in real terms, be doing differently from what the Modi administration has been doing?
I think there are three respects in which I think we need to rethink what we're doing. One is, clearly we need to concentrate much more on our neighborhood, by which I mean the subcontinent and the Indian Ocean region, which is our immediate neighborhood, on strengthening our relationships here, on integrating ourselves with these economies, and on being a net provider of security in this area. We cannot be exclusive. We cannot say nobody else will be here, because today we are close to the geopolitical center of gravity of the world. And so the world's troubles actually also affect us, and they try and drag us into their quarrels, whether it's China, US, and so on. But we need to concentrate on our relationships with our neighbors. That's one thing. Secondly, we need to have a coherent foreign economic policy of how are we going to engage with the world, which are the things that we want to do. We're the only major economy which is now, that is not a member of any of the regional trading blocs. And the world economy is being fragmented into RCP, CPTPP in Asia. North America has the USMCA, EU in Europe. And each of these is becoming more and more self-reliant in a sense. So we need to actually engage and see how we plan to engage with the rest of the world. I don't think it's enough just to produce slogans. Third thing, this is a time of very rapid change in the balance of power. And we've seen the effects of that. We've seen it on the border with China. We've seen it in all these flashpoints, hotspots, which are now live all around us, whether it's East China Sea, Taiwan, South China Sea, etc. This is a time, therefore, when you need to manage change, but work with everybody. On different issues, you will get different partners. So you need very active diplomacy, but it has to be the hard work of diplomacy, the hard slog, not summitry and grand gestures and grand statements or big claims. And forget about image and so on. You need to actually follow just your hardcore interests, which is India's security, India's prosperity, these two things, and transform India. That's what all this is about. So for me, actually, these are the three things where I think we need to do a lot. We have a lot to do at home. And like all good foreign and defense policy starts really at home. So self-strengthening. But I think that everybody understands the things. We are undergoing military reforms. We are doing various things. But I'm not sure that it's part of a larger vision of how India and the world interact.
You mentioned that we need to engage more actively in the neighborhood. And, the Manmohan Singh government had started the Look East policy. This government actually took it one further and said, Act East. When he came into power, he in fact invited all the neighboring leaders for Republic Day and his own swearing in. So what do you think has made this shift away from really integrating, and why is all our neighborly relations in such a bad way? And the other question is that right through, you spoke of a kind of strategic autonomy, that you just have different relationships with different countries based on your needs. So one big ambition of this government has been to move closer to the US, and become a strategic ally of the US. Do you think that that's been a wise move? Is that that is a big departure from India's diplomacy in the past? Is it something important to do, or do you think that's also got negative connotations?
Well, I don't think actually that moving closer and what they've done for India-US relations has been bad for the relationship or bad for us. No, I think in fact it's useful. And to some extent, I think this was a necessary step in the transformation of India-US relations. I had argued, and certainly under Trump, there was a narrowing of the relationship to purely defense, security, intelligence, and there were a lot of small arguments on economic issues, for instance. But I think now we're going back to a broader India-US relationship. And I say this because for me, India-US relations are important, essential for the transformation of India. It's not to contain China or to deal with some other power, because the moment you make it about China or about Pakistan or about Afghanistan, then Afghanistan controls your relationship with the US. We should be in that relationship for our own interests. And for me, that interest is the US is an essential partner in our building our economy, in our security, certainly in our maritime security across the Indo-Pacific. We have increasing convergence on these issues. We work together with them. So we are where we are today. It is doable. It's been done. We've done it for almost 70 years. And we've done it on a smaller scale in the Middle East, where we've worked with powers who don't talk to each other. But we've worked with all the regional powers, whether it's Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, Turkey, Israel, and we've managed it.
I know that any criticism you give will be seen as partisan, but speaking in the hat of a national security advisor, former, as well as a very seasoned diplomat yourself, do you think that the Modi administration has been able to position India like that in the US relationship? Do you feel that our relationship with Iran, with Russia, with the Middle East, all of that is really now being impacted by the US-India relationship rather than your own reading of situations?
I don't know. I can't speak for this government. Let me say one thing.
As an observer, you know what's happening. So don't be a diplomat in the interview.
I'm telling you the truth, because I have no idea to what extent. Take, for example, Iran. There have been US sanctions against Iran for a long time, and before they did the JCPOA, the nuclear deal between themselves. But we had made it clear to the Americans that we needed Iran, not just for energy. We had found ways of actually continuing to import oil despite US financial sanctions. And we had set up an account in India where we paid them in rupees. And they then used those funds, which were we needed Iran for access to Afghanistan. And we kept that going as well. And the Americans understood, because these were logical geopolitical reasons and our interests were involved. We worked with them. This time, however, we seem to have stopped buying oil from Iran. You've seen what's happening because, and this is where I say, you have to cut the Modi government a certain amount of slack. Today is a very different world, changing much more rapidly, and it's a much harsher world than the world that we had, say, in 2007, 2008, 2009. And today, many more things are in flux. Today, for instance, Iran can turn to China to an extent that she never could before the global financial crisis. And that's what's happened now. So in a sense, Iran remains very important to us, but the context in which their operating policy is very different. So therefore, I say, it's very hard for me sitting outside to say, oh, this is what they should be doing today with Iran. But I will say that Iran is important to us. Second problem, I don't think there is a broader vision of how do we handle such a changed world and fit all these pieces, not all, many of them contradictory, into that broader vision and therefore devise a policy. That I don't see. That's what worries me.
So we left one part of my question unanswered, which was that when you said a very important focus of our diplomacy should be the neighboring area, and we've moved away from that. In fact, we have very fractured relationships with our neighbors now. What do you think went wrong with the Modi administration when it began with that impulse and then, we seem to be faltering?
With our neighbors, you have to remember that what happens in your country, in their country, these borders are all porous. They don't stop politics. And if you are going to play domestic politics with your neighbors, then the consequences are going to be very different from if you try to insulate what you do at home from what happens abroad. So therefore, I think what has happened in the recent past is that whether you look at Nepal or you look at the effects of, let's say, the CAA and so on Bangladesh, on opinion in Bangladesh, you can't call people termites and then expect them to like you. So there is an issue there. In each case, I think it's a question of how do you handle these issues? When, say, an issue like the Rohingyas comes up, this is a problem between two of your essential and very good friends, neighbors, Myanmar and Bangladesh. Your reaction cannot be conditioned by how will it play at home. You can't start by calling them terrorists and so on. You have to, to my mind, the first reaction should have been, my two friends are in trouble, I'm going to go and try and help them. If we can, let's try and find a way to A, manage the humanitarian problem, B, try and settle this between yourselves in a way that at least keeps the peace and doesn't affect either of you too much. We didn't do any of that, which surprised me. We would have in the old days. Instead, and we didn't even deal with the humanitarian problem. We've always been relatively open to refugees. We've isolated them. We haven't assimilated them, but we've isolated them and then worked for conditions which allow them to go home. And that would have been the logical response to the Rohingya problem, rather than labeling them terrorists and dealing with it, because that alienates both sides. It alienates not just the Rohingyas, but the Bangladeshis as well.
I'm going to come back to analyzing this administration because it pertains to all of us. And the 3-4 big pieces I want to look at is US, China, and the Middle East, because these have all changed in big ways. But one point you make in your book is that we're at a hinge moment in global politics. And, there have been other hinge moments, of course, the Cold War, even the 2008 crisis, which you lay out all the massive impacts that had. But you call this a really big hinge moment. Was that the whole shift to China as a power polar sort of, rising? And you said that the whole fault line of world politics now is in our neighborhood. So one, could you spell that out? And do you think 2020 and the pandemic then has become a fresh hinge moment altogether? And what shape will that take?
Well, the way I see it, we are between orders. There was an order which came out of World War II with two superpowers. And then with the end of the Cold War, that collapsed. We had a unipolar moment. With the global financial crisis in 2008, that unipolar moment also ended in a sense, because you are now, if you look at the world economy, it's really multipolar. China is a global economic superpower, not yet political or military, but an economic superpower. In military terms, the world is still, there's only one global military superpower who can project military power across the globe, anywhere. That's the US. And in political terms, it's very confused because the old order, which primarily is the multilateral institutions, whether it's the UN or we've all seen how badly they performed during the pandemic. I mean, frankly, it's ineffective. And it's less and less effective since 2008. They had to, it was the G20 which had to do what it could to get the world economy going after the global financial crisis. Uh, China and the US haven't taken their tariff war or economic arguments to the WTO, which is where, logically, that's where you should go. But no, because nobody has faith in that system or the order. So we are actually between orders in a very confused situation when you look at the globe as a whole. Today, therefore, when you're between orders, it's very hard to say, okay, this is the nature of the world today, and therefore these are the things we'll do. And it's caused by four things, to my mind. One is a shift in the balance of power. The most obvious is the rise of China, but other powers have risen too. India, there are Korea, Indonesia. I mean, you can count, there's lots of countries which are rising actually. Some people call it the rise of the rest. But there's shifts in the balance of power. There's the slowing down of the world economy. The globalization decades led to high growth years for all of us, and we were maybe the second biggest beneficiary after China. But the world economy now is fragmenting, has slowed down since 2008. And thirdly, you've seen the rise of new authoritarians, partly because globalization was seen as a threat to identity. So as governments can deliver less in a slowing economy, leaders start relying then on nationalism, on charisma, on personality cults, on huge promises. And we know this from our experience, but we're not the only ones. I mean, China, you see it across the board. Trump was a good example of it. So you see the rise of new authoritarianism. And you see the emergence of a whole new host of sort of security issues, a new agenda. You know, maritime security, cyber security. Cyber is a new domain in outer space as well. But most important, as a consequence of the first three, all your flashpoints and hotspots are live today, whether it's the India-China border, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's South China Sea. I mean, you name it, they're live, and there's no prospect of political solution. There's no international order, certainly. There's no multilateral solution. But even bilaterally and so on, none of these seem, in fact, they all look much more dangerous than they've looked for many years. All four trends have been accelerated by COVID. COVID has not changed them yet. Maybe it will. Maybe if it goes on and, maybe it will. But as of now, what it seems to have done in the last year and a bit is really to accelerate these trends. The slowing of the world economy. COVID has diminished all powers. Don't believe anyone who tells you we handled it well, we won. Everybody, their own governments, their leaders have been diminished in the eyes of their people across the board. That's why I think it's a hinge moment.
What is the role that you see China, at least emerging? You're a real expert on China, that it's had many shifts itself. And, one, it's trying to create a separate global order, both in financial terms as well as in terms of technology. So it's not just its military ambition. How do you read China? And what did China in the immediate context achieve with its border aggression on India right now? What was its aim? What was its signaling?
The PLA's role in internal decision-making has grown over time, because ever since Tiananmen, the dependence of the leadership on the PLA for internal political reasons, ultimate sanction of the state was the PLA, and they used it in 89 against their own people, but also externally, because one result of reform is that China, for the first time in her history, is both powerful but also very dependent on the world. Almost 40% of her GDP is the external sector. She depends on the world for energy today. Since 93, she is no longer self-sufficient in energy. She needs the energy that comes. So the maritime security of all these waters, I mean, Hu Jintao, the previous president, used to say that China has both a Hormuz dilemma and a Malacca dilemma, because all her supplies could be cut off. She needs to export because she needs to import. She is an importer of technology. She needs access to markets. She needs raw materials to keep her economy going. So she is now dependent on the world. It's something that they're not used to in history. We are used to this. to being connected, to being both dependent and also as therefore controlling a trade and so on. For China, this is a whole new experience. For the first time in her history, she's trying to become a maritime power because that's where the sea lanes carry her lifelines, actually. But what China is doing, therefore, is trying to cut down on her dependencies to the extent she can. If Malacca is a choke point through which all her energy, everything comes, she will build alternative corridors. CPC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, to Gwadar, through Kyokpo in Myanmar. She'll try and find other ways, Belt and Road, all the way through Eurasia into Europe. She'll try and find other ways of accessing her markets, commodities, etc. She's bought up ports around the world. These are all ways of, does this amount to building a new order? No, I don't think so, not yet. China is the greatest beneficiary of the existing order. She wants to change it into something that works even better for her, where she has an even better say. Now, the core of that order, right from post-World War II, Bretton Woods institutions, has been US financial control of the system. China's trying to break that dependency. So she started an official digital currency. She's entered into separate payments arrangements, bilateral with Russia, with big source of energy now. Where she sees a threat to her own internal stability and security and regime continuous, she will build a separate internet of her own. I'm not convinced that China is building a new order. How will China behave in the future? She'll be Chinese, more and more Chinese. And China has not behaved like, say, the UK did or the US when they were the most powerful countries on earth, when they were dominant in the global order. She won't behave the same as them. She's never behaved like that in the past, nothing in her history. And her condition is quite different from them. She's aging very rapidly. She's in a very crowded neighborhood with other countries rising around her. Her economy is slowing. I mean, the secular trend is quite clear, and it's reverting to mean. But I don't think she's building a new order yet, and she hasn't come up with one. For me, the important thing is watch what China does. From about 2 years ago, the Chinese started saying India is no longer non-aligned.
So, no longer non-aligned.
Non-aligned. What they meant was that they saw your improving relationship with the US, and they had expected you to stay neutral between them. But they saw interoperability, especially the defense agreements and so on, as changing that fundamentally. So one of the restraints on them, that if they pushed India too hard, India would get pushed into being closer with the US. That no longer applied because from their point of view, you'd already gone over to the dark side. That removed one restraint. But why they did what they did, trying to change the status quo, and basically tearing up all the standard operating procedures all the way back to the 1993 agreement and trying to change the status quo on the LAC, only they can answer. The rest, for our part, it's speculation. To you, I think the message was clear. We have the power, and we can embarrass you when it suits us. To other people, the message was, maybe to the US, the message was, you think India is a countervailing power to China? They can't take care of themselves. And it's a similar message to your other neighbors, saying, you think you can rely on India to keep China off? No, come and deal with us directly. And to you also, the message is, come and talk to us, deal with us. You can't avoid us by strengthening your relations with the US, by doing other things around. I'm speculating here, because no Chinese is ever going to tell you this is why we did it.
It brings me to the two leaderships, a big punching bag of the middle class, certainly the Modi administration now is Nehru. How do you rate the mistakes that Nehru made and what mistakes has Mr. Modi made?
About the reaction, by the way, you have to remember that there was tremendous sympathy for Nehru after 62. Everybody's first response was, poor Nehru's been betrayed by the Chinese. And so it's not as though everybody immediately said, oh, what a terrible failure, his China policy and so on. There were people who had attacked his China policy from 1959 onwards, when it became clear there was a boundary dispute. But there was also tremendous sympathy. And I think we're at a similar stage with this government, where everybody in India is convinced the Chinese betrayed us. They betrayed Prime Minister Modi. He met Xi Jinping 18 times. It was so nice to him, took him home to Ahmedabad, but look what they've done. I think there's no question. Nehru made mistakes in his China policy, where when he said there's no problem, and he didn't discuss it and didn't force the Chinese to actually come and settle it when we were doing the trade agreement on Tibet, for instance, in 54. And once it was out in the public, I think he was almost too democratic, because by then in 59, the Dalai Lama came across the line, Tibetan refugees pouring across the line. He had very little negotiating room left because of public opinion, parliament. Everyone was so worked up about what the Chinese had done. And everyone saw this as betrayal by the Chinese, because they ducked the issue through the 50s until 59 January, when Zhou Enlai's letter said so. And so once you say that boundaries are fixed, there's no problem, then there's nothing to negotiate. And then when there's a real problem on the ground, then how do you deal with it? And your own public opinion leaves you no place, no space to negotiate. He forgot that you need a solid material base of military power and economic power if push comes to shove. And we were dealing with a highly militarized state on the other side. So yes, he made mistakes, but some of those mistakes, there's a risk that you could do the same today. When you deny that anything happened, then there's nothing to negotiate. Then where's the give and take? How do you actually get him to go back to the status quo? Are you accepting where he is? There's all kinds of questions. There is a problem when you adopt that kind of attitude. The Chinese are adopting a similar attitude this time around. They no longer say these are all disputed areas, that both sides think it's on their side, etc. They say this is a matter of China's sovereignty, which means they can't give. There's no negotiating, there's no bargaining here, there's no give and take left. So you're now getting into a really dangerous position if you look at the stated positions of both sides. For me, this is not a good situation to be in.
When we speak of Atmanirbhar, do you see any major shifts happening in making us independent in the zone of cybersecurity, technology? We have Chinese penetration into almost all our security networks, and several generals that I've spoken to on this show have all said that, there's a huge strategic vulnerability that we now have, which is not so much traditional military vulnerability as that all our systems, from telephone to cybersecurity to energy, electricity, a lot of that has vulnerability to China. Do you see India making any of those shifts? And in that context, do you think Atmanirbharta is a good goal to set for oneself?
Welcome to the new world. I mean, we are not the only ones who now find, we have so many vulnerabilities. Chinese have as many vulnerabilities. The Americans have vulnerabilities, as you've seen over and over again. Question is, how do you handle them? Do you build in resilience in your systems? Can you cope with what they can do to you? Can you do the same to other people? Successive governments of India have worked at this problem. You can't think of it in old military terms. You need to think about how do you work around them? How do you create vulnerabilities in the other person's mind? And then how do you then operate despite these vulnerabilities? Because some of this just comes with the technology. At this stage, on cyber at least, I would say be a little careful in jumping to conclusions.
Right.
I'd be very careful, actually. Because it's not like we don't have the talent, we don't have the people, we don't have the knowledge. We do. Do we have the organization? Have we actually put in place the systems? That's where, and that nobody's going to tell you. Because the moment you tell everybody, then you create more vulnerability.
I wanted to focus a little bit on the Middle East. You mentioned that there's a lot of flux there as well. But do you think the Modi administration has done well in reaching out to a lot of the Muslim countries in the Middle East and seems to be following an independent strategy there?
Well, I think what they've done with the Middle East actually has been good. And
isn't good.
Is good, has been good. And to a very great extent, much of this, whether it is counterterrorism cooperation with Saudi Arabia, with the Emirates, with Qatar, much of this has been going on from the beginning of the century. And we've started around, and some of it started in NDA 1, some started in UPA, but they've carried that on and brought it to the stage where it is today.
So let me then ask you, in a more broad way, that what do you think are the, like I said, there was a very flamboyant international diplomacy that Mr. Modi undertook. So what would you think are some of the things that he has achieved, which you think are achievements? And you've also already talked about how we've bungled the neighborhood, but what would you count then as big negatives that have come about from their diplomacy?
I think a big achievement was making sure that the India-US relationship was not affected by the Trump years, and in fact kept developing. That, I think, was really quite an achievement. Not very many people can say that. Not many other partners of the US can say that to the same extent. Maybe we and the Japanese, but otherwise there's no others. Secondly, I think what's happened in the Middle East, as you mentioned, I think that's also been good. But I do think that the overall lack of a structure, and you cannot substitute for a vision, for structure, for the hard work of diplomacy by personal contacts and summitry. It's not enough. And I think that maybe was part of the problem. And you see that also in, Ab Ki Baar Trump Sarkar, when you personalize diplomacy, it always carries risks with it thereafter. And unnecessary risks, frankly. It was their election. Whoever was going to win would win. And
isn't that, you're being mild about that. Isn't that a really big gaffe, to do on an international stage?
I think it's part of the same approach to foreign policy, that foreign policy is a personalized business. It's between leaders. This may have been true in the 15th century, when you had princes and kings, but no longer. Today, it's between states who have national interests, who have bureaucracies, who have much bigger structures. This is not just about two individuals deciding something. And I think that problem, in fact, that at one level, that's also the core problem in India-China relations. Because China is ultimately the world's biggest bureaucracy, oldest also, but I mean, it's the biggest bureaucracy, and it is run like a bureaucracy. And it's not run by leadership contacts and so on. The leader's job is to put the sanction or the stamp of approval on what the system then develops. And they run the system. They tell the system what to look at, where to go, and so on. And I think maybe this is why I say you cannot personalize foreign policy to this extent without paying costs on the side.
So enumerate the costs. You said that it's not been structural, but what else has blown up in our face because of that?
Well, I wouldn't say that things have blown up in the face because, this is still India, don't forget. It's not about Modi or about his government. People are dealing with India. And they, except whoever is running India at that time, they will treat well if they treat India well. And for the reasons that they are interested in India, they will work with whoever. When he's gone, you'll hear what they might tell you what they really thought. But that's later. Today, they will deal with whoever. So things are not going to blow up because things don't blow up. India is a large, influential geopolitical player in the world, important to the world economy, important to the world's politics. So people will deal with you right through. So things are not going to blow up. Even when you get into frictions with neighbors and so on, ultimately the relationship will rebalance. But you won't forget what happened. I mean, some people say one reason why the US was so slow in responding to your needs in the second wave was because of this memory of the relationship with Trump.
So that brings me to Nehru. As I said, he's now everyone's favorite punching bag, like it's a joke that should Nehru have ordered the vaccines for 2021, so, but when you analyze him as in terms of international diplomacy, what do you think Nehru achieved? And again, you spoke about how he made mistakes in China. Did he make other mistakes, for his time.
I actually think he did well with a very weak hand, with no experience. Hadn't run even a municipal corporation before. So he actually did very well. He created space. He didn't fall into geopolitical traps. And he actually laid the basis for India's transformation. We wouldn't be what we are today with a shot at actually becoming a prosperous, secure nation if it weren't for Nehru. In the China case, for instance, when you actually read the files, you realize that he saw things very clearly, but he didn't see himself having very many options to deal with it. The big difference is he took responsibility. I mean, he'd stand up in Parliament and argue about it and say what there was. And he was in Parliament every day through the crisis. He didn't shut Parliament down. And for me, that is remarkable. And he actually let his critics have their say.
One of the grouses that a lot of, particularly our strata of people have against Mr. Nehru is for not aligning with America much earlier and during the Cold War years. Do you think that was a big mistake, that he did not ally with America? Or do you think that actually kept us safe? Because now one can ally on or have a strategic partnership based on some amount of self-confidence, then it would have made us into a client state. Is that a fair assessment?
I had an American friend once who told me that, it's only countries that we defeat who actually do well after the war, Japan and Germany. But if you look at all our clients and allies, most of them have declined once they joined the alliance. I don't know. This is a what if. What would have happened if we had chosen to join the American camp in the Cold War? I have no idea. But I don't think it was an available choice, given the whole situation at home and what needed to be done at home. Don't forget, we were a post-colonial state, and we needed to actually dismantle those connections and to start building our own country from the ground up. And I don't see how joining a US alliance was going to help us do that. And the obvious answer to you is simple, is look at what happened to Pakistan, which joined the alliance system.
You mentioned your Chinese friends. Mostly one has no sense of what goes on inside China. Do you think that their prosperity just historically is moving them towards at least some amount of impulse for greater democracy, more freedom of knowledge than they have? Is there any tensions brewing within China that you know of?
Not in the Western sense. They're not heading towards democracy with elections and political parties and this liberal sense of... They have no tradition of the Enlightenment from which all this stems originally. We have an indigenous tradition of democracy going all the way back to the Lichavi Confederacy, to Buddha's time, we have, of Gana Sabhas, etc. We have our own tradition to draw on, and we've combined the best of both. But the Chinese have no such tradition. But yes, they will have to change the structure. Today, China spends more on internal security than she does on the PLA, which tells you something about the level of stress in that society. It's very hard to predict where China is going, actually. Chinese themselves actually are asking lots of questions. And this is the interesting thing. It's supposed to be a very totalitarian, authoritarian society. But Chinese scholars and so on ask among themselves and publish articles saying, what is China? Asking questions which, if you tried to do that in India, you'd be accused of being anti-national. So it's a closed society with an open mind. It's an interesting situation. Some people think we are the opposite.
So sitting in 2021, if you were to forecast like one big area of concern, which you can see, what would it be? And is there anything that you feel optimistic about?
I'm optimistic about India in the long run. I have no doubts about India as a whole. What I do worry about is our own internal polarization and divisions among ourselves. I don't think there are any existential external threats to India. If there are, they are internal.
Thank you very much, Shankar. Always fascinating to talk to you. And we could do this for 5 hours longer, but thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All the best.